All right, so please welcome our featured luncheon speaker, Dr. Donald Miller. Thank you, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Jeremy. Regarding today's topic, I have both personal and professional reasons for studying what I'm going to share with you today. The Spanish flu killed my grandmother, Mary Ashby Warden Williams, and her stepmother, Mary Lyde Hicks Williams, my great-grandmother, painted this portrait of her with her 18-month-old daughter, Charlotte, my mother. Mary Ashby died several weeks after this portrait was painted in January 1920, age 24. At the tail end of this pandemic flu, her daughter Charlotte endures, and we celebrated her 102nd birthday last month. I spent part of each summer with my great-grandmother at her antebellum home in North Carolina. She quite liked me, and I her, but she said I should have been sent to military school to learn better manners. The Spanish flu also killed my wife's grandmother, Agnes Poston, an Irish immigrant, aged 26. Professionally, I have maintained a long-term interest in viruses, vaccines, HIV/AIDS, and vitamin D, and have written articles and given talks on these subjects, including one on HIV/AIDS at the 33rd DDP meeting in Ontario, California. I'll address these subjects. More than 30 million Americans had the Spanish flu in a population of 105 million, and with 675,000 deaths, a 2.3% fatality rate. Fast forward to today. The Director General of the UN's World Health Organization is Tedros Ghebreyesus, an Ethiopian politician, and the first non-physician to head this body. Early on, he declared that COVID-19 had a 3.4% mortality rate. With a rate this high, COVID could kill many millions of people worldwide. This spawned a global panic. The Director General, however, left out people who became infected with this virus but did not get sick and were not tested. Up to 80% of people who test positive for COVID have no symptoms or just mild ones imitating a cold. Counting them would make the mortality rate for COVID-19 be substantially lower. The 1918-20 influenza pandemic killed between 15 and 100 million people worldwide, 0.8% to 5.6% in a population of 1.8 billion. Now, with a population 7.8 billion, a pandemic of comparable lethality would kill 60 to 430 million people. The Spanish flu started in Kansas. It spread in three main waves. The first one, from March to June 1918, was relatively mild. Soldiers called it the three-day flu. It was seldom fatal, with a mortality rate near 0.5%, 5 deaths in 1,000 cases. The second wave, from August to December, was more lethal. One observer noted, while the first wave of flu in 1918 was relatively non-lethal, the second made up for it in spades. 2 million American soldiers were shipped to Europe to fight in World War I. More soldiers died from flu than in battle. SARS-CoV-2, systemic acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, is one of some 7 coronaviruses that infect humans. Several of them cause the common cold. 2 kill people, SARS-CoV-1 and MERS-CoV, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. The 2002 SARS epidemic caused 774 deaths, and the 2015 MERS epidemic, 866 deaths. They did not come in waves. The current coronavirus likely will not have a more severe second wave either. The Spanish flu targeted healthy young adults between ages 20 and 40. The nations fighting in World War I censored any mention of the influenza pandemic, which laid waste to both sides. Spain stayed neutral and did not censor its newspapers. They reported it, and thus came the name Spanish flu. The best source on accurate and unbiased facts about COVID-19 is the independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit research group Swiss Policy Research. It publishes frequently updated, extensive COVID facts in 25 languages. Elderly people are the high-risk group with COVID-19, especially those with obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. The average age of COVID deaths is 82 in the US, 86 in Sweden. People under age 50 have a close to zero risk of dying from COVID. Ones between infancy and age 19 have a 10 times greater chance of perishing in a car accident than dying from an infection caused by this coronavirus. Most healthy adults without pre-existing medical conditions do well and have immune systems strong enough to handle the virus. The jury is still out on whether SARS-CoV-2 is bioengineered, and if the biosafety level 4 lab in Wuhan, China did indeed release it, presumably by accident. But this virus is not lethal enough to be called a bioweapon. Migrating water birds spread the Spanish flu to humans. Over the holidays, my wife, Linda, and I took a 2-week cruise to Hawaii on the Star Princess, sister ship to the Diamond Princess from Los Angeles, returning there on January 4th. The Diamond Princess finished a round-trip 15-day tour of Southeast Asia on February 2nd from Japan. It had 2,606 passengers, median age 69, and 1,045 crew, median age 36. Some passengers tested positive for COVID on the cruise, and Japanese authorities quarantined the ship when it docked back at Yokohama. Its passengers for up to 3 weeks and crew 4 weeks. Health workers tested almost everyone on board for COVID in this, quote, ship laboratory and found 712 were infected. 567 passengers and 145 crew members. There were 14 deaths, 0.4%, only in passengers over age 70. Swiss Policy Research cites an increasing number of studies showing that the overall lethality of COVID-19 is between 0.1 and 0.4%, considerably lower than initially thought. Likewise, the CDC now estimates that the overall COVID-19 death rate is 0.2 to 0.4%, 2 to 4 deaths in 1,000 people, near that of seasonal flu. And then there's New York City. Its COVID mortality rate in the boroughs is at 7 and 8%, and are substantially higher than other cities like the ones in Texas. Along with counting people who actually die from the virus, officials will also count people with the virus as a COVID death who die from something else. Last month, Washington State revised its COVID death numbers downward when it was revealed that anyone who died for any reason who also had coronavirus was listed as a COVID-19 death, even if the cause of death had nothing to do with COVID-19, like in a motorcycle accident. Some hospitals will even put COVID-19 on death certificates as a cause of death without a COVID test ever being done, unfortunately, often for financial reasons. It is a true fact that authorities have overcounted COVID-19 deaths. Less than 1% of Americans live in nursing homes, but they account for more than 40% of all COVID deaths. In Canada, 80% of COVID deaths came from nursing homes. Under an executive order that Governor Cuomo signed on March 25th, he had 6,300 COVID-infected patients shipped to nursing homes in New York State. Families were prohibited from visiting their loved ones in them to see how they were doing. On April 23rd, when the nursing homes objected to his plan of prohibiting them from screening for COVID-19, he said that they, quote, don't have a right to object, and that, quote, this is a rule and that is a regulation and they have to comply with that. He stopped this on May 10. This helps explain why New York City has such a high COVID mortality rate compared with other cities. 4 other governors, all Democrats, also placed COVID-infected patients in nursing homes, listed here. Social media calls this a boomer remover. One observer, Jim Quinn, puts it this way: this nasty virus, supposedly let loose from a Wuhan biolab, is less deadly than the annual flu among those under 65 years old, and more deadly when purposely introduced into nursing homes by politicians. With the COVID lockdown, there is this community alert. Computer models in the UK and one funded by Bill Gates at the University of Washington both greatly overpredicted the number of deaths COVID-19 would cause, forecasting that more than 2 million Americans would die. This prompted government officials across the country and worldwide to shut down their economy and order people to stay home, without considering its ethical and economic implications, and to practice social distancing like with these children. No medical or scientific evidence justifies this. Adverse consequences on human health and behavior from the lockdowns include domestic violence, child abuse, suicide, other potentially fatal medical conditions going untreated, civil unrest, and a substantial rise in shootings and crimes. These consequences of lockdowns have yet to be fully reckoned and measured. They will surpass COVID deaths. The lockdown cure is worse than the disease. In an interview with Dr. Joseph Mercola, Barbara Loe Fisher says this: the authoritarian lockdown approach by government to the coronavirus pandemic has been framed as a choice between safety and liberty. Public health officials have persuaded lawmakers to divide the American people into 2 classes: those who are considered essential and allowed to continue working, and those who are considered non-essential and barred from earning a living. Small businesses and services judged to be non-essential have been forced to close their doors, while paradoxically, everyone is free to roam through grocery stores, drug stores, and big box stores like Walmart, Target, and Home Depot, owned by big corporations. What we have allowed to be done in the name of public health has no parallel in American or human history. Face masks do not work for respiratory viruses. As Dr. Merritt pointed out, SARS-CoV-2 is 0.125 microns in diameter. The openings in N95 masks is 0.3 micrometers in diameter. Randomized controlled tests show no significant reduction in virus transmission and do not support government edicts to wear masks. Face masks are dehumanizing. They represent submission to authority and are a sign of obedience, like we are seeing in Nevada at this hotel. Masks can impair breathing, cause hypoxia, lowered oxygen content in the blood, and hypercapnia, increase carbon dioxide levels, which Jane has measured in many people, and cause headaches and fainting spells. Hours spent wearing an N95 mask can decrease blood oxygenation by 20% and cause loss of consciousness. A man in New Jersey driving his car while wearing this mask passed out from a lack of oxygen and crashed into a pole. Even the New England Journal of Medicine admits, we know that wearing a mask outside healthcare facilities offers little, if any, protection from infection. In many cases, the desire for widespread masking is a reflexive reaction to anxiety over the pandemic. There were no vaccines for the Spanish flu. Vaccine companies a century later are working non-stop to develop one for COVID-19. Human trials to confidently establish a vaccine's efficacy and safety, however, take time, from 18 months up to 5 years. And 93% of vaccine trials fail. Vaccines for flu viruses have a checkered history. Public health officials had to recall the one made for the 1976 swine flu when it was found to cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, immune system damage with slowly progressive paralysis. Vaccine officials promoted the vaccine pandemics for the 2009 swine flu and fast-tracked it without the requisite clinical trials. The vaccine caused narcolepsy, difficulty sleeping at night, associated with night terrors, hallucinations, and mental health problems, mainly in children. The Trump-attacking media chastised President Trump for promoting the anti-malarial drug hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19. An increasing number of studies, however, show that hydroxychloroquine does work. The drug must be started early and given in the right dose, 400 milligrams a day, not when the disease is far advanced, using doses 5 times normal, 2,000 milligrams, as studies that show no benefit do. Remdesivir, given intravenously, provides only a marginal benefit and is not worth its $3,000 cost. 6,200 milligram tablets of hydroxychloroquine cost $20. Dr. Merritt has gone into this in more detail on hydroxychloroquine this morning and is quite correct on that and also on vitamin D. One technique for dealing with the Spanish flu a century ago, little known today, is fresh air. Medics then found that severely ill flu patients nursed outdoors recovered better than those treated indoors. It turns out that outdoor air contains antimicrobial hydroxy radicals generated from the interaction of sunlight with ozone in the air and are a natural disinfectant. Sunlight itself is germicidal. Its UV rays kills viruses floating in the air as aerosols, and its UVB rays synthesize vitamin D in the skin. Heat greater than 80 degrees, 0.6 Fahrenheit, also kills coronaviruses. 15 years ago, I researched and wrote 2 articles on vitamin D. Vitamin D in a New Light and Avoid Flu Shots, Take Vitamin D instead. They have stood the test of time, as the March 22 review cited here confirms. Among the 13 vitamins that our bodies need, vitamin D is a hormone, a 3-carbon ring steroid hormone. In addition to its well-known role in calcium metabolism, vitamin D controls the expression of more than 200 genes and the proteins they produce. Ones that express mediators that regulate the immune system, that release neurotransmitters like serotonin, which influences one's mental state, produce proteins that halt cancer by inducing programmed cell death, apoptosis, And vitamin D activates genes in immune system macrophages that make antimicrobial peptides, antibiotics the body produces to attack and destroy invading bacteria and viruses. With the Spanish flu, young healthy adults would wake up in the morning feeling well, start drowning in their own inflammation as the day wore on, and be dead by midnight, like our grandmothers. From a macrophage-induced severe inflammatory reaction to the virus called a cytokine storm. Caught in a cytokine storm, one's own immune system could kill a flu victim, something researchers have found that vitamin D can prevent. This study correlated COVID-19 severity with a patient's vitamin D blood level. They found that 86% of COVID patients who had a mild illness had a normal vitamin D blood level, 30 nanograms per milliliter or above, whereas a substantial number of COVID cases that became severe or critical had vitamin D deficiency. When I worked at the Seattle VA hospital, I measured vitamin D blood levels in all my heart surgery patients. I was shocked to find that only 22% of the vets had a normal vitamin D level. The level was insufficient in 12%, deficient in 56%, with levels between 8 and 19, and 10% were severely deficient with a vitamin D blood level of less than 8 nanograms per milliliter. Nursing home residents have the lowest vitamin D levels. They are kept out of the sun and are not given vitamin D supplements. Milk is fortified with vitamin D, but at 100 units per serving, one would have to drink 200 glasses of milk to obtain as much vitamin D as the skin will make fully exposed to the noonday sun. Black Americans die from COVID at 3 times the rate of white people, most likely because they tend to be more vitamin D deficient. Their dark skin hinders sunlight from rapidly synthesizing vitamin D from the 7-dehydrocholesterol in the skin. Another vitamin, vitamin C, given intravenously in high doses, is proving to be an effective way to salvage critically ill COVID patients. A good treatment protocol for COVID-19 is vitamin D 10,000 units per day, zinc 75 to 100 milligrams, hydroxychloroquine 400 milligrams, quercetin 1,000 milligrams, and if necessary, azithromycin, an antibiotic, 500 milligrams per day to prevent bacterial superinfections. The central component is zinc, which inhibits RNA polymerase activity of coronaviruses, blocking their replication. Hydroxychloroquine and quercetin, a widely available plant flavonoid, enhance the cellular absorption of zinc, enabling zinc to do this. For the Spanish flu, some physicians had patients take aspirin up to 30 grams a day. A dose that high is toxic and causes pulmonary edema, a potentially fatal buildup of fluid in the lungs. Aspirin was a relatively new drug in 1918. Physicians today consider 60 to 300 milligrams, 0.06 to 0.3 grams, to be the best and safest dose for aspirin. "1913 was a bad year. Woodrow Wilson, a progressive, became president. And in 1913, 2 methods were enacted for progressive big government to obtain the money it would need to do all the things it wants to do. The 16th Amendment, giving Congress the right to tax people's incomes, and the Federal Reserve Act, providing a new, unlimited way to print money. Now, the Fed creates money by simply tapping keys on a computer. Today, more than 99% of currency exists in digital form. With the Spanish flu, until the armistice ended World War I on November 11, 1918, President Wilson kept the nation fixed on fighting and winning the war, ignoring the worsening influenza epidemic. During peace negotiations in Paris on April 6, 1919, President Wilson caught the Spanish flu. He became seriously ill, returned home, and 4 months later had a severe stroke. The Spanish flu helped bring on the 1920-21 depression. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 47%, industrial production fell 32%, and corporate profits 92%. The newly established Fed stood aside, and the government, with Wilson disabled, did not provide any fiscal stimulus to help cure this depression. With the national debt reduced by 1/3 and tax rates lowered, the economy recovered quickly on its own. The COVID pandemic has pricked the debt-fueled everything bubble and has likely brought on a greater depression, or as some say, like Gerald Celente, the greatest depression. Maintained with multi-trillion-dollar bailouts, it could persist for years, like the Great Depression did. The depression we may endure will have started with COVID triggering mass layoffs, disrupting capital and trade flows. Like knocking down a series of dominoes, ultimately even the safe sectors of the economy, tech, healthcare, higher education, and finance get crushed. Today's bankruptcies and unemployment rival that of the Great Depression. As Doug Casey put it, we've entered a downturn that is going to be longer, deeper, and different than the unpleasantness of 1929 to 1946. And financial analyst Michael Pinto, this is a global depression just like we had in the 1930s, combined with a 2008-style credit crisis. COVID-19 is sending us into a brave new world, one where left-wing terrorists push a neo-Marxist revolution and technocrats an authoritarian technocracy. Political and media narrative managers would have Americans live obediently under COVID lockdowns, wearing masks and social distancing. George Floyd, Antifa, and Black Lives Matter's protests and riots accepted. George Floyd died from a fatal dose of fentanyl. For some people, a 3 nanogram per milliliter blood level of fentanyl is fatal. Floyd had 11 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl in his blood, along with 5.6 nanograms per milliliter of its metabolite norfentanyl, plus methamphetamine, 19 nanograms per milliliter, and 3 other drugs. And fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more powerful than heroin. An overdose of fentanyl can produce excited delirium, followed by wooden chest syndrome, muscle rigidity of the larynx, chest wall, and diaphragm. George Floyd repeatedly complained of difficulty breathing and said he wanted to lie down on the ground. In recently released body camera footage, one officer, Thomas Lane, says, "I just worry about the excited delirium or whatever," to which Sergeant Derek Chauvin says, "Well, that's why we've got the ambulance coming." Officer Chauvin restrained George Floyd using an approved knee-applied side neck hold, while another officer held his feet so that he would not flail about and use up what little oxygen he could breathe until the paramedics arrived. The fentanyl-induced wooden chest syndrome caused George Floyd's shortness of breath, not the policeman's knee applied later. The autopsies showed no trauma to the body. The political media's narrative on George Floyd's death is false. If they get a fair trial, Sergeant Derek Chauvin, charged with murdering Floyd, and the 3 officers under his command, indicted for aiding and abetting him, will all be found innocent. Antifa protesters and rioters are wreaking havoc in Portland and Seattle and tearing down statues across the country. On its website, Black Lives Matter declares that its mission is to, quote, eradicate white supremacy. People who say to its followers, all lives matter, court trouble. A recent Harvard graduate, Clara Janover, posed a TikTok video where she threatened to stab anyone who told her that all lives matter. Dr. Leslie Neal Boylan, Dean of Nursing School at the University of Massachusetts, was fired after she sent an email to her staff saying, everyone's life matters. And Jessica Whitaker, a 24-year-old nursing assistant, shown here with her 3-year-old son, Grayson, when confronted by a Black Lives Movement in Indianapolis, insisted to them that all lives matter. As she walked away, a member of the mob shot her in the head and killed her. A more fitting name for this movement is Only Black Lives Matter. Fortunately, a substantial number of Black Americans, when asked to choose between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, a majority of Black Americans pick All Lives Matter. This movement seeks to eliminate whiteness, like Hitler did with Jews, starting with the cis white males. It also seeks to extinguish white culture, including classical music and operas, largely composed and performed by white people. This has begun by attacking the UK's Royal Opera House for remaining silent about Black Lives Matter's protests. It reminds me of the fur protesters in the 1990s harassing my wife and other women for wearing their winter fur coats to the Opera House in Seattle. Americans today are becoming increasingly compelled to live under an authoritarian technocracy, which Whitney Webb describes in her article, Techno-tyranny, how the US national security state is using coronavirus to fulfill an Orwellian vision. In order to keep up with China in artificial intelligence, the COVID pandemic is enabling the Pentagon, intelligence community, and Silicon Valley to implement AI mass surveillance systems. They seek to remove obstacles that have prevented their implementation under the guise of combating the coronavirus crisis. The John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019 created the U.S. National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. The Commission cites 3 legacy systems holding back adoption of AI-driven technologies: cash and credit, debit card payments, individual car ownership, and receiving medical attention from a human doctor. In their place would come financial transactions done only with smartphones and computers, ride-sharing driverless cars, and AI robotic medical care. Authoritarian technocrats would also have us stop shopping in stores, many of which are going bankrupt with the lockdown, and buy everything online, enabling them to track and tax our purchases more easily. In Generations, the history of America's future, William Strauss and Neil Howe discuss how current generations mirror ones from the Anglo-American past and fall into 4 generational archetypes. These are the American generations alive today. The Pew Research Center has found that only 17% of Black Lives Matter protests were Black. 46% were white, most of them millennials under 35 years of age. It would appear that a substantial number of people in America's younger generations view their history and culture negatively. Public and private schools and colleges have taught them to view white people as the source of abuse and oppression. Rather than progress in a linear fashion, as commonly thought, Strauss and Howe posit that human history has a seasonal, cyclical nature, Each cycle averages about 80 years, roughly equal to the human lifespan. Beginning with the revolutionary cycle, 1704 to 1794, America is now in its fourth cycle, the millennial cycle, 1946 to 2026. Each cycle has four parts termed turnings: high, awakening, unraveling, and crisis. The Spanish flu occurred in the third turning of the Great Power Cycle, COVID-19 in the fourth turning of the current millennial one. Strauss and Howe named the fourth turning in each cycle, where the country's institutional life is torn down and rebuilt. The American Revolution occurred in the fourth turning of America's first cycle, the Civil War in its second one, and the Great Depression and World War II in the fourth turning of the third cycle. The 2008 global financial crisis kicked off the fourth turning crisis in the current millennial cycle. One hopes that this fourth turning does not trigger World War III. On it, Strauss and Howe write, "The risk of catastrophe will be very high. The nation could erupt into insurrection or civil violence, crack up geographically, or succumb to authoritarian rule. If there is a war, it is likely to be one of maximum risk and effort. In other words, a total war. Every fourth turning has registered an upward ratchet in the technology of destruction and in mankind's willingness to use it. If war can be avoided and humanity escape a nuclear holocaust, the outcome of this fourth turning could be positive." They write, "America could enter a new golden age, triumphantly applying shared values to improve the human condition. The rhymes of history do not reveal the outcome of the coming crisis. All they suggest is the timing and dimension. We live in challenging times that call for disaster preparedness." This is how I see it from Leavenworth, Washington. Thank you.
Well, that was great. I just have a question about vitamin D. So this, I was told by a COVID nurse that most people now at the university where she is in the COVID unit are all over 400 pounds. And you see obese young people that aren't hypertensive that seem to do badly sometimes with this. Is obesity and low vitamin D levels somehow, you see is there any correlation there? I just wondered because it's a fat and soluble.
I think the correlation is that they go together. But I don't know the statistics on how many obese people have normal vitamin D levels.
I just wondered if it put you at more risk for having low vitamin D, given the solubility of D. I don't know.
Well, they probably don't take vitamin D supplements, and they probably don't go out in the sun as much as other people that go for walks and are outdoors.
One brief comment. You did not elaborate much on Antifa. If I can add something about that word, everyone who lived in Germany in 1961 remembers, just like every American who was alive in '63, the Kennedy assassination, remembers the going up of the Berlin Wall. The official name of the Berlin Wall, the official name given it by the East German terror regime, was Antifaschistischer Schutzwall, the anti-fascist protection wall. That is one part of the history of what Antifa means. The other one is, under the Stalin regime in the Soviet Union, beginning in the 1930s, the Soviet Communist Party instituted the language policing of the day, and they said everything that is not communist is fascist. Therefore, everything that is anti-fascist equals communist. It's a very simple equation. So again, that's the history of Antifa. Anytime you hear that word Antifa, means communist, nothing else.
I fully agree. They're against fascism, but they're for communism. And unfortunately, these kids have been educated to think communism is better than the American way of life. That's it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr.